Hello, welcome back again. We are actually going to cover two modules in this video here. The first one is module 46, and it's all about gender development. Then we will do module 47, which is about your parents, your peers, and your early experiences. And that's actually a pretty short one. So let's go ahead and get started with both of those now. All right, so first thing that we need to cover with gender development is understanding the difference between your sex and your gender. So your sex is your biologically influenced characteristics by which people define male and female. So it's purely based on like what kind of reproductive parts do you have. Gender, on the other hand, is a socially influenced characteristic by which people define boy, girl, man, woman. And gender is not necessarily the same thing as gender identity. It's not necessarily the one that you choose to go with, but it might just be what is like the social construct of what a girl is, what a boy is. So what kinds of toys does a boy play with versus what kinds of toys a girl plays with, what they wear, that kind of thing. That might go more into gender. And we'll talk about gender identity a little bit at the end of this. So kind of just some differences and similarities between men and women. Again, I'm not going to go through all these slides here, so you can definitely look back on your own. But basically, the idea is that biologically, we are pretty dang similar between men and women. So really, we're not as different as we might tend to say that we are. Both men and women have needed to survive, reproduce, and avoid predators. So today, we are in most ways alike. So evolutionarily, we've pretty much developed in very similar ways. Of course, there's some differences. Like I said, reproductive constructs that we need and everything, those are different, but we all have, ideally, we all have 23 chromosomes that came from your mother, 23 from your father. So we are more similar. However, there is a couple of gender differences that we see. Well, actually, sorry, here I was going to tell you still that just by telling someone if you are male or if you're female, that really tells you nothing about your abilities in vocabulary, your happiness, your ability to learn, any of those kinds of things. So clearly, it's not like your gender is really tied with specific differences between the two. And we usually say like the opposite sex, but in reality, we're pretty similar. So I did, though, want to point out here a couple of differences that we do see, though. So in terms of men being different from women, and again, I'm not talking about any of these things here in terms of gender identity. I'm going more in terms of your sex and your gender, so your biological and your social construct of sex and gender here. So the average girl enters puberty earlier than the boy. Women tend to live a little bit longer. Women express emotions more freely. They smile and cry more, use more expressions like love and being so excited. Women can usually detect fainter odors, so a better like sense of smell, offers to help more often, and can become sexually aroused sooner than men. Women do have 2 times the risk of developing depression and anxiety disorders, though, and 10 times the risk of developing an eating disorder. So some things are maybe some good qualities to have. Others are linked more to different clinical disorders that we have. On the opposite side, men tend to have more likelihood of dying by way of suicide or developing an alcohol use disorder. May also include for men that they are more likely to potentially be on the autism spectrum or have ADHD or colorblind in some sort of way, and as an adult might be a little more at risk for antisocial personality disorder. I want to stop right there and pause for a second because the stuff listed on this slide here is a lot of like, here are the bad things that are different between them. So please don't focus on these parts. And as I said with the last module too, if you are either a woman or a man, don't necessarily think that you are 100% going to live up to whatever they say here in these slides. Again, this is just research based, and what we tend to see is the difference, but you shouldn't take this too much to heart of you identifying who you are based on some of these similarities and differences here. So do we have a similar sense of self-esteem? Yep, pretty much. Men and women pretty much have the same amount of self-esteem, and which can increase and decrease different stages amongst your life. One big difference between men and women, though, is that men do tend to admit to more aggression, especially in a physical way. Men tend to commit more violent crime than women. And men do usually engage more in hunting, fighting, warring, and supporting war than women do. Again, if you're a man, does not mean you would necessarily fall under these categories. It's just what we see when comparing the two genders. We do have this difference here, though, between aggression and relational aggression. So aggression itself is any kind of physical or verbal behavior that's intended to harm someone physically or emotionally. So that's kind of, I feel like, what you might think of when you hear the word aggression. Relational aggression is more like you are having aggression in some sort of way that you're trying to ruin someone's social relationships with other people. So relational, like their relationships with others. So it might be things that are more tied to like bullying and those kinds of things, which can then hurt like your social standing at the school and everything. So our first question here, according to research, which type of aggression is more common among males than females? That would be letter A, harmful physical aggression. That's what we just saw there. I'm gonna move this box up there. There we go. You can read that one on your own. Something else we see is that girls do tend to be more interdependent. So as children, they tend to play more with other children than by themselves. But they do usually have a smaller group of friends. So that's kind of different to our side with boys. They typically form larger play groups and have lots of activity, competition, little intimate discussion. So that's kind of one of the big differences we see in terms of relationships with other people. Women tend to have smaller friend groups, but more intimate, deeper relationships with them, meaning maybe like talk through different issues or problems you're having a little bit more. Whereas men tend to form larger groups, but maybe not quite as deep connections with each other and focus more on like activities that they could do together rather than just talking. So I know that there is kind of a social construct of, you know, like masculinity versus femininity. And I'm not necessarily saying that that is true and that's 100% supported. This is just what tends to happen amongst the different genders here. Gonna go past that one. This stuff here you can kind of, I'm sure you're familiar with on your own. So I'm just gonna quickly go through it. Obviously, there's some gender bias that can occur in the workplace, which I feel like we have especially seen in the past couple of years with like the Me Too movement and everything. So some things that can contribute to that gender bias could be perception, compensation, family care responsibilities, everyday behavior, and interaction styles. So quickly looking at each of them. In terms of perception, usually power behaviors that women have are tend to see as aggressive and met with criticism. Whereas those same power behaviors in men are seen as like, oh, they're a good leader. They know how to take charge and everything. So there is kind of a difference in the same behaviors between men and women, the way that they might be received. Obviously, I think you're probably aware of a big gender gap in our income and everything. So women in traditionally male occupations have received less than their male colleagues. That's something that I feel like we have made some improvements on, but are still trying to work very hard towards. There's family care responsibilities. Again, based on traditional social roles that we have typically seen that mothers are doing more of the childcare, approximately maybe like twice as much childcare as the fathers. So in the workplace, women are less often driven by money by money and status. They tend to compromise a little more, and they often opt to work reduced hours because they have other obligations outside of the home. Doesn't necessarily mean at all that fathers do not do the same thing. Again, just what we're seeing here. Interaction styles. So men are more likely to offer opinions. Women are more likely to express support. And finally, everyday behavior, how does that affect it here? So men are more likely to talk assertively, interrupt, initiate touches, and stare. Women tend to smile and apologize more than men. So just some things to consider here. If you are someone who is a man or identifies as a man, keep these things in mind of how I feel like in some ways it could be the same thing of how you might have implicit biases that happen. You don't necessarily mean to do certain actions, but they could happen. So just keep them in mind. And women, I feel like there have been many improvements in these things over the years, but it always helps to continue to speak your mind and voice your opinion and everything and fight for gender equality. All right, so what about a role? I've mentioned that a couple times now. So in general, a role is a set of expectations or like norms about some kind of social position you have and what kind of behavior you're supposed to have. So there's lots of different kinds of roles. Like we might have like, what is the role of a mother? And that means that she's supposed to like coddle her children and make sure she nourishes them and provides them lots of love. That might be just like a general role we have for a mother. There are also roles that we have with gender, and those are the set of expected behaviors, attitudes, and traits for males or females. So again, that's kind of where we're getting into now, like what does it mean to be masculine versus what does it mean to be feminine? You don't have to fall into those roles. That is just what society has come up with, but we are definitely starting to see that shift over the years as we realize more and more that you should not have to be forced to play a certain role and you can do whatever fits best for you. So we do also have gender identity that I mentioned earlier we were going to be coming to. Your gender identity is your own sense of being male, female, or some kind of combination of the two, or neither. You're gender neutral. So as I was mentioning before, just gender itself is more socially kind of how are you identified by gender. Gender identity is how are you yourself identifying your gender. And it could be the same or different from your biological sex. So gender roles are definitely changing a bit. I'm not going to mention those specifically. We do have social learning theory, which hopefully you remember back from our unit on learning. This is also called observational learning. And that is definitely something that plays into the different gender roles that we see. So like here, if you see a man mowing the lawn, his son might be more likely to imitate that behavior, mow the lawn too, more so than a daughter would. And you can definitely keep that in mind if you have children of your own. And if you don't want them in certain fixed gender roles, you could make sure to kind of break that kind of mold there a little bit and make sure that maybe the mom is demonstrating mowing the lawn and her daughter can be imitating that, something along those lines. And that kind of goes with gender typing, which is the acquisition of a traditional masculine or feminine role, kind of like you're supposed to fall into this role you're supposed to play. But again, we're seeing some shifts away from that over the recent years. Do parents matter in the development of gender roles? So now is when we're getting into the environmental side of things, the nurture side. So parents do help to transmit their culture's views on gender. So parents with traditional gender views were more likely to have gender-typed children who shared their cultural expectations about how males and females should act. Another study found when fathers share equally in housework, equally with the mother, their daughters develop higher aspirations for work outside the home. So, we can see how the role of parents, guardians, whoever you have as your caregiver, those can kind of make some kind of impact in terms of how you identify with gender roles. Is there another option? Yes, there is. And we are seeing more and more coming towards this kind of middle ground, I guess, rather than those separate roles. And that is called androgyny. So it's a blend of male and female roles. So the good things we have seen about androgyny is that androgynous people are more adaptable. They can be more flexible in their actions and their career choices. They tend to be more resilient and self-accepting and experience less depression. So it's kind of, rather than being set into a fixed role, you kind of take a little bit from both. And you might have some characteristics that are more masculine, some that are more feminine. And so some of those things go along the lines of like, if you're a boy or a girl, you might feel comfortable dressing the same way as each other. It doesn't matter if like a boy could be wearing a skirt or a dress. He doesn't necessarily have to just be in sports clothes or something like that. Another example is maybe like the father is cooking meals for the family rather than something that traditionally used to be a mother's role. And I was kind of saying this one here, like pants, shorts, tees of every color are worn by both boys and girls. Those are all examples of androgynous behaviors. So there's definitely ways that children can kind of decipher gender roles as well. And it's interesting because children are not born with knowing that different genders exist. It's something that they kind of tend to pick up on. And again, through that observational learning, a lot of times learn it from their parents and things that they're observing. So that can kind of be developed because of gender expression, which is said through some things like language, where we tend to say men are handsome and women are beautiful. They have like different words for being attractive. Their interests might be different. Daddy golfs, but mommy bakes. So those are things that kind of go into forming these gender roles and your ideas about what each of them are as a child. And children kind of like pick up on these cues throughout the world. Kind of the same thing. The stereotypes of what a boy is and what a girl is tend to be most rigid at about age 5 or 6. So if a new neighbor moves in and is a girl, a 6-year-old boy might assume that he and her cannot share the same interests as each other because they're a little more rigid in their understanding of gender roles there. Then we also have transgender, which is this kind of umbrella term describing people whose gender identity or expression differs from that associated with their birth designated sex. So it could be someone who is born male but identifies more as a female, or opposite, someone who is born female but identifies more as male. Those are kind of some people that could fall in the category of transgender. And there are lots of different nuances here and everything. So this is just kind of this umbrella term, as we were saying. And just to kind of bring out, transgender is the opposite of cisgender. So like CIS. If you're a cisgender, that means your gender identity is the same as your biological sex. But then transgender is when it's opposite of that, when your biological sex is different from your gender identity. And gender identity is different from sexual orientation. So if someone is transgender, that does not necessarily tell you anything about their sexual orientation. So they might be sexually attracted to people of the other gender, which would be heterosexual, people of the same gender, homosexual, or both genders, bisexual, or even no one at all, which is asexual. So these are lots of different roles you can definitely learn more about on your own. And honestly, I think a lot of you know a lot of this. So I'm going to move a little bit past that because we are now done with that module number 46. So we're going to go ahead and move to module 47, which is pretty quick here. So it's about parents, peers, and early experiences. So again, kind of sticking with the nurture side of things of how does your environment shape you as a person. So we do see that early experiences can kind of modify your brain here. So one experiment that happened is these researchers raised rats either alone in their own environment without like anything to play with, just a rat in a cage by itself, or in an environment with other rats where they have other rats to interact with and different things to play with, those kinds of things. Those were the two different environments they raised rats in. And they saw that those raised in the impoverished environment, when they were by themselves with nothing really to do, they saw impoverished brain growth then too, which was evidenced by the brain weight and the growth of their synapses. Pop quiz, what's a synapse? Remember, that's kind of like our neural connections that are forming, how your neurotransmitters are getting sent and everything. So here you can see, and you'll be able to compare in a moment, but like this is the impoverished rat brain cell here. Whereas on the other hand, the rats raised in the enriched environment with lots of things to play with and other rats, they usually developed a heavier and thicker brain cortex. And you can see there is more um, of an enriched brain cell for the rat there. So here's both of them together. You can see how much smaller this one is in the impoverished environment and this one in the enriched. So that definitely makes a huge difference. The synapses increase and are much stronger in the rats that were in the enriched environment. All right, how does practice increase neural development? So one thing we've seen is, like, for example, string musicians who start playing before age 12 have larger and more complex neural circuits controlling the note-making left-hand fingers, because that's how you change the notes on a string instrument, than do string musicians whose training started later. So this is kind of touching on something that Ms. Jessel had covered in a previous module, and it's called synaptic pruning, the use it or lose it kind of thing. So if from a young age you are really developing a certain skill, those synapses are going to keep firing, getting stronger and stronger. But if you're not really doing those things from a younger age, then your brain is naturally, it's a natural process and it's fine. Your brain is going to stop paying as much attention to those connections and they sort of start to like die off a bit. So you could still learn and you could still develop those neural connections, but it just happens a lot stronger and better if you start from an earlier age while your brain is still forming and creating those different synapses. We have seen this multiple times now, this Romanian orphanage study. You can look back at that on your own. All right, question here. Compared with rats raised in an enriched environment, which of the following is true of rats raised in isolation? Seconds. All right, that's letter A. Their brain cortex is less developed. So we saw that they do better in the enriched environments. We do see that touch and stimulation can increase cognitive development as well. And this kind of goes back to, who was it from the last module that we talked about and their experiment with attachment? That was Harry Harlow and the contact comfort thing. So touch really does make a difference. So for infants like premature babies who are born, if they have skin-to-skin contact with their mothers, those children then tend to sleep better, experience less stress, and show better cognitive development 10 years later. So touch really does make a difference in your developmental growth. How does experience change the brain? So remember back from unit 2, I believe, that your brain is it has a lot of plasticity, meaning it can change and shape a lot and adapt to new things. So new neurons can be born. It can reorganize the way certain brain structures are being used. If a monkey pushes a lever with the same finger many times a day, brain tissue controlling that finger will then change to reflect that experience. So that's one way that plasticity is happening in the brains. All right, what about parents? How much do we blame them or give them credit for the way that we turn out? We do see that shared environmental influences in the womb and onward typically account for less than 10% of children's differences. So in the words of these behavior geneticists here, 2 children in the same family are, apart from their shared genes, as different from one another as are pairs of children selected randomly from the population. So definitely some differences that we see. Parents should be given less credit for kids who turn out great and blamed less for kids who don't. So it's definitely not just all the parenting that happens. Definitely have different cultural differences in parenting styles and expectations with our children. Our peers also definitely impact our behaviors as well. So this is something I'm sure you can realize in your own lives, especially as you are growing up with different friend groups and everything. So preschoolers who don't like a certain food will tend to eat that food if they're put at a table with a group of children who like it. So they see like everyone else likes this, so okay, maybe I should too. Children who hear English spoken with one accent at home and another in the neighborhood and at school will likely adopt the accent of their peers, not their parents, which is pretty interesting there. And this one, which is pretty dangerous, teens who start smoking typically have friends who model smoking, suggest its pleasures, and offer cigarettes. So keep in mind how powerful peer influences can be. Peer pressure is a thing. It's not just a made-up construct. and make sure you're making wise decisions independent of what your friends might be doing. And as this is saying here, we play, date, and partner with our peers. So youths can be sensitive and responsive to peer influences. Those are the people you're seeing all the time and growing up with together. And parents can have an influence on those peer relationships, kind of just depending on some things of like how involved the parents might be in those relationships. So one thing could be the power to select a child's neighborhood and the school they go to. Obviously, that's not necessarily an easy thing. That depends on your socioeconomic status, how much money you're able to bring into your family. So it's not like these are always practical things that can be done. But if there's the option, that's something that could potentially help. Since neighborhood influences matter, parents may want to become involved in intervention programs that aim at a whole school or neighborhood also. And that's it, folks. So like I said, that one was short and easy, kind of a lot of stuff that you probably know about just from your own life and interacting with parents, peers, other people. So sorry this was a longer video there, but I'm going to stop now so it's not any longer. Have an awesome day. Goodbye, everybody.